Good evening, all. I want to approach the topic of today based on this question, which was posed to me by my student in the master's course of Language and Communication in Mathematics Education. She asked me, would you send your child to a Zulu Medium Primary School? So this question will be for me the leitmotif of my presentation. And I'm going to present based on what research says. As you know, I'm coming from a mathematics perspective. So my presentation will be a bit skewed towards mathematics. We all know what the language and education policy says. Learners and parents can choose to learn in any language of their choice. But of course, we know the current practice. We know that for most learners and for parents too, learning should be done in English, and they rather prefer their child, the parents would rather prefer that their children learn in English. We also are aware, of course, that in fact, after grade 3, most schools switch from home language to English. Of course, there are schools where English is taught right from grade 1. And there are schools where there's no switch at all. Even though fundamentally, even though the policy says there should be a switch if they wanted, most schools in the rural areas don't, in fact, switch. Now, what does research say? I'm going to approach that based on the research that has been done in Ethiopia by Hugh, and also I'll look at research that has been carried out in Papua New Guinea by Philip Clarkson, and then I'll link that to the threshold theory proposed by Cummings. Before I proceed, I think I would like us to have my working definition of language proficiency, and I'm going to read it. Language proficiency means is an individual's knowledge of English. Okay, in this particular case of language, and the degree to which the individual exhibits control over the use of that particular language, including vocabulary, grammar, and discourse conventions, which may be called upon at any instance of listening and understanding, of course, reading, oral and written language use. And that definition is from Peregoy and Boyle. So I prefer that definition because it kind of covers for me what language proficiency should be and what we should be looking at when we say there has to be proficiency in Zulu or proficiency in English. Now I want us to look at the study that was done in Ethiopia. And my purpose of choosing Ethiopia is strategic. Ethiopia is made up of a number of regions, not provinces, regions. And even though their language in education policy says that they have to study in their home language, in the particular indigenous language, for a period of 8 years before switching, different provinces apply this policy differently. So you can see that in some provinces, 8 years is applied. So they use their mother tongue for 8 years. Before then, they switch to English in grade 9. In some other provinces, they decide, well, for mathematics, it's going to be 6 years in the home language, and then for other subjects, 8 years. And then for mathematics, the switch will be done in the 7th year. For some other provinces, some other regions, they have 6 years of instruction in the home language, and then in the 7th year they switch, and so on and so forth. So even though the language and education policy says they have to have mother tongue education for 8 years, they apply it differently. And I want to see how these has impacted on the academic achievements over the years. Hugh and Benson and all, they did a study there in 2000, and 2004, and 2008. So they compared the academic performance of students, of learners who were in these different provinces with different length of mother tongue instruction. And this was what they found. I'm only presenting that of 2004 for lack of time. So we can see that these provinces with 8 years of mother tongue instruction performed at 44%. If we look at the mathematics, 44%, 42, 42, 41 in general, and then for average, they were all there in the 40s. Now, those with 6 years, see these 3 regions at 6 years, 46, 42, 42, and 41. But then, look at the average. The average goes down. But what we notice is that the very best result is for those provinces where they have a longer time spent in learning in their home languages. And the next best is regions where they have equally a long time, but that's not as long as the first, and so on and so forth. Now it is interesting to see that in this province, in this region rather, where there's no mother tongue instruction in the home language, we can see, but of course they have intensive second language teaching for 6 years. They performed the poorest. Now, we can now go to the next study by Clarkson. So Clarkson investigated the effect of bilingualism on the cognitive abilities of students or learners. So this study was prompted by the need that we have right now, which is the need to provide informed data as to whether or not multilingualism or the use of learners' home language impeded or enhanced mathematical understanding. And so the participants were these. There were students who were proficient in mother tongue only, those who were proficient in English only, and then those who were neither proficient in home language nor proficient in English, and then of course students who were proficient in both languages. And what did he find? He found that bilingual students who were proficient in both English and their mother tongue, their home language, actually outperformed all the other groups, despite the fact that most of them were in actual fact from a particular region where of particular schools which were not as well resourced as those who were from the monolingual setting, where they had English as their home language and taught in English and did everything in English. And then those who performed the poorest were in actual fact those who were neither proficient in the home language nor proficient in English. Now this resonates with what Cummings talked about in his threshold theory. Those aspects of bilingualism which might positively influence cognitive growth are unlikely to come into effect until the child has attained minimum or threshold level of competence in his second language. So, the higher threshold is necessary to avoid the negative benefits of bilingualism. So that means that once a learner has attained a certain level of linguistic competence in his or her second or third language, positive cognitive results can now begin to occur. Okay, and the child can progress, as the child progresses towards competent bilingualism, then there is a greater possibility or a greater cognitive advantage attached to that. Now, when Cummings combined his his developmental interdependence hypothesis with the threshold hypothesis. He came out with the suggestion that cognitively beneficial bilingualism can achieve, beneficial bilingualism can be achieved only if the learner's first language is adequately developed. And that's what we saw in the research, in the 2 research studies that I have just presented to you. Can home language actually contribute to the learning of mathematics? I want to cite 2 examples, just 2. And the first will be the issue of multiplication. Most of the times, if we are asked, what is 7 times 10? We just know it is 70. But then in a class where the Zulu concept of pinda pinda is brought in, learners begin to understand better because pinda pinda in fact means repeat repeatedly. It actually captures the whole concept of multiplication. 7 is simply, 7 times 10 is not just 70 for just being 70. It is 7 in 10 places. You've repeated 7 10 times to get 70. And so that concept actually brings forth very strongly the notion of multiplication in mathematics. The other point I want to, the other instance I want to bring to the fore is that of the turning point. And I apologize to those who are not mathematically oriented. Okay, now in Francia's first class, okay, research rather, there were 2 classes. One was monolingual, Afrikaans speaking, and the other was Zulu, a multilingual class where they used Zulu to communicate in addition to English. So the concept at hand was graphs, quadratic graphs, and more specifically the turning point. And so they were discussing the turning point. And then in the monolingual class, the whole concept of turning point was discussed unproblematically, while in the multilingual classroom, where the teacher actually asked the learners to talk about what turning point actually means in their home language, Zulu, they came to a conclusion that, in fact, the word turning point is difficult to conceptualize in Zulu. And why was that? Because you are talking about something that is turning, and yet you are talking about a point. So it is some form of an oxymoron that they found difficult to conceptualize. And based on that, they decided to come up with descriptors of what mathematically we call turning point in their home language, and also expressed it in English. I can tell you the truth. If you ask those students today what turning point means or is, they will remember and they will be able to tell you what it is. So I strongly believe that other languages in the class have something to contribute to the development of mathematical knowledge in any classroom. It is rather the harnessing of these opportunities that poses problem, and we'll come to that. Now I come to my question. After I've talked about all of these, would I send my child to a Zulu Medium School? And my answer is no, I won't. I won't send my child to a Zulu Medium School. Now, if I would send my child to a Zulu Medium School, for example, am I making a recommendation, as did Mhlanhla earlier, that the South African education language policy should be modeled after countries like Nigeria, that in spite of many indigenous languages existing in their cultural fabric, English is used as the official unifying factor? No, I still will not make that recommendation too. Okay, Would I also say that because those who spend 8 years in their home language, studying in their home, rather, those who have 8 years as doing all the subjects in their home language are better off than those who have 3 years or 4 years, or would I say that? I'll still be very reluctant to say that. I do not believe in importing a particular strategy that has worked somewhere as it is into the South African society, for example. Much as we have something of a wider value to learn from what has happened elsewhere, we've got to be careful about importing strategies. First of all, let's look at LS recommendations. The Nigerian languages are very autonomous, very autonomous in the sense that if one person from one tribe speaks, the next person, even if they are neighbors geographically, may not understand. And that's very different. That's very different from the context of South Africa, where you have mutual intelligibility between languages of the same group. And in the case of Ethiopia, there's also what is called linguistic distance. What the research is silent about is the linguistic distance between the home languages that are in question here and English, and also between even the home languages themselves, and how they influence or impact on the academic achievements we've just seen here. Now I'll go back to my reasons for saying no. I believe that to be able to tap the knowledge or the languages that are present in the class, to be able to make good use of those languages in the class, it's not something that comes with just a mere being in the present, maybe in a multilingual context. It is an artisanal activity. It has got to be learned. It has got to be learned. And code switching too. Code switching is not as straightforward as we think. If we want to use code switching as a strategy very well, it is something that comes with time. It is something that is also artisanal, something that has to be learned. And we just don't learn how to code switch by being in a multilingual classroom. The other issue is there's got to be some way of mediating the transition from home language to English as the language of instruction, of teaching and learning. It is not wise that in a class from grade 1 to 3, learners are taught in Zulu, and then all of a sudden in grade 4, they switch to English. There's got to be, while they are studying in Zulu in the home language, there's got to be competent teaching of English as a second language in that foundation phase. There's got to be competent teaching of English, so that by the time they are in grade 4, they are better able to understand what is happening and not feel like they are thrown into the deep blue sea. The other issue is code switching. Why do we think code switching is always bringing in an indigenous language? Why can't there be code switching in the foundation phase? Why can't we bring in English while we are teaching them concepts in Zulu? Why can't we bring in English and use English while we are teaching them also? So it shouldn't be a one-way traffic. Once they're in grade 4, we keep switching to the home language. That's fine, but what about the other direction too, in the foundation phase? Now, going back to the issue of the transition, there's got to be appropriate training of teachers to manage the transition. So, I give you a quote here from a particular student of this university last year. Some years ago, the Limpopo government sent their teachers, their foundation phase teachers, to Wits University to retrain them. And they did 4 years. They finished, some of them, not all, finished last year and went back to teach. Now they were trained in English. Okay. Now they've gone back to Limpopo. They are teaching in a different language. So there is an underlying assumption here that there's that what they have learned here at Wits University in English can be recontextualized into a different linguistic setting. There's an assumption that there's no problem with that. They will be able to do it. And as we can see from the quote there, it's not as easy as that for them. They learned everything in English, now they have to go back and teach in their home language. Okay, so how do we deal with this particular issue? So one way is to suggest that, well, there's got to be teacher training in the home language at foundation phase. And I'm quite aware of the language policy at higher education, or in higher education in the country. But then, there are implementational challenges to this. Of course, you know the whole issue of additive bilingualism, which I forgot to mention when I was talking about the policy. The policy, the language policy is all about additive bilingualism, whereby the language, two languages are developed, kind of, and I'm going to give you my preferred definition of additive bilingualism as we move on. So, but in terms of the challenges of implementing this, there's got to be the development of the South African indigenous languages as languages of scholarship. And when I mean languages of scholarship, I don't simply mean the development of terminologies, because that's what has been happening. The development of terminologies. I mean also things like, if we want to talk about Vygotsky's ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development, how do we discuss that in Zulu, for example? If we were to teach these foundation phase teachers the Vygotsky theory in Zulu, how do we say that? How do we develop that? How do we express that? And now, what has been happening so far is one group of intellectuals and linguists sitting together and coining terms here and there. And then further in another corner, you have another group doing the same thing. And then if we call that right and left, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. That's what has been happening so far. So now, if we have to develop strong scholarship in our languages, then there's got to be the will by the government to have a centralized body, as it happened in the Maori kingdom. The Maori people had the same issues as we are discussing now. But then what they were able to do was to have a centralized body where the language was developed, terms that did not exist were coined, and it went through a lot of processes before then they agreed that that was what they were going to use as an appellation for A, B, or C. Okay, so that's it. That's got to happen. The government has to, the Department of Education has to have the will to do that. Okay, but then there's also the issue of buy-in from stakeholders. Research by Setati shows that, in fact, parents don't want to learn mathematics. They don't want their children to learn mathematics in their home language. The students themselves, the learners themselves, don't want to learn mathematics in their home language or languages. Then how do you get them to, how do you buy them in? That has to be treated, or that has to be an issue that needs to be tackled. Another challenge, which I've also already mentioned, is the training of teachers. I don't even want to go to cost, because you know cost you can get around. But the training of teacher educators, who is going to train these people? How many qualified foundation phase lecturers do we have who can comfortably train our foundation phase pre-service teachers to teach any of the subjects in Zulu, for example? How many of them do we have? Very few, very few. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, additive bilingualism comes at a price. Until this price is paid, I'm afraid I'll have to go for second best. And that second best will be to send my child to an English medium school right from grade 1. Okay, to conclude, additive bilingualism is a very fantastic idea, and we've seen from research that in fact, proficiency in 2 languages, in home language and English, is a good thing. But it seems to me that additive bilingualism is very political. So, for what purpose is it? Is it for political reasons, or is it for the sake of developing proficiency in both the home language and English? I really like the definition of additive bilingualism that says it is a process by which students develop both fluency and proficiency in a second language while continuing to develop proficiency in the first. It's not a case where one overrides the other. The two can move together in a particular continuum. Okay, and by extension, we can talk about code switching, but I'm running out of time. Is code switching for the purpose of fluency? Because most of the times, when teachers at schools use code switching, it's actually because they like the term in English that they want to use, and not always. I'm not by any way generalizing. But a lot of times is to make life easy for them, first and foremost, rather than to make the concept understandable to learners. So I believe in the strategic use of English as second language in the foundation phase, okay? And learners' home languages as second language in higher grades to develop mathematical concepts. Thank you.